the threat of cyber attacks on the U.S. economy through the financial system. The Fed is very focused on cyber risk in general. The U.S. economy is just going to slow down. The GDP growth number for that quarter could be significantly reduced. If the Fed were not to supply liquidity, it could become an issue of survivability of one of these banks, and the Fed simply doesn't want to do that. How could the run happen? How damaging could it be to the banks? What about the spillover effects on the macroeconomy associated with large wholesale depositors simply avoiding the banks? We don't believe that there's any particular reason for customers to lack trust in the solvency of the banks. There could be a reason for a loss of trust in the liquidity of the banks in the short run. So have on standby an emergency payment node. What it is, it's just another bank whose only purpose in life is to stand up when and if there's a cyber event, which means that the Fedwire itself is mission critical. So this is not a way to avoid using Fedwire or ACH. You can't rule out all possible attacks. You can only do what's reasonable in light of the most likely forms of attack. My name is Darrell Duffie. I work here on the finance faculty at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. I was speaking with Josh Younger, my collaborator on this project, about the threat of cyber attacks on the U.S. economy through the financial system. And Josh and I decided to take a somewhat different point of view. Most of the literature is heavily oriented towards the information technology, hardware and software. But we were more concerned about the economics and spillover effects onto the broader economy. And we took an approach which some in the risk management industry call reverse scenario analysis. What does that mean? Actually, I learned about this from another collaborator here in the Stanford Statistics Department, Professor Amir Dembo. And the idea of this is, suppose you're way out in the tail of some risk, then ask the question, what's the most likely way that you got there? In this case, if you were really to have a massive spillover effect onto the US economy, the most likely way to get there from a cyber event is that it wasn't simply a bank or two banks that failed to protect their customers' assets. More likely, there was some sort of run. How could the run happen? How damaging could it be to the banks in terms of their liquidity, their ability to continue to provide liquidity to their customers? And then finally, what about the spillover effects on the macroeconomy associated with large wholesale depositors simply avoiding the banks and therefore not making a lot of the payments that they would normally make on a given day? Okay, so how would a cyber run occur? What would it look like? So the first act of this drama is some bad actor manages to conduct a denial of service attack, corrupt the data, steal deposits of one or more of the largest banks. So a cyber run is a situation in which the largest wholesale depositors in the largest US banks decide not to take the risk that their funds could be held up because of a cyber event. And instead, they move their money out of the bank and make their payments or try to make their payments some other way. So it's not necessarily the fear that they lose their money. It's that they can't get access to it quickly enough that causes them to run from the banking system. Okay, so the public's trust in the banking system rests on both the solvency of the banks, that is, trust that the banks have more than enough assets to meet their debt, and also on the liquidity of the banks, so that if you were to ask the bank to make a large payment on your behalf, they would have the funds. Or if you wanted their money out of the bank, they would be able to give it to you on short notice. It's the second liquidity related trust that Josh and I are most concerned about in this particular project. And in the event that a severe cyber attack occurred, we don't believe that there's any particular reason for customers to lack trust in the solvency of the banks because it's unrelated to solvency. There could be a reason for loss of trust in the liquidity of the banks in the short run. For the purposes of our study, we focused on 9 of the largest US banks, 4 money center banks, 2 banks which are traditionally investment banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, and 3 large custody banks. So the first thing to consider when analyzing whether these banks themselves can survive this kind of a run, a cyber run, is not how much capital they have, because this is really not a matter of their solvency. It's more a matter of their liquidity. So do they have enough cash to both meet the needs of their current depositors who are withdrawing funds, and then enough to continue to supply liquidity to others who need funds in the short run? We looked into that in quite a lot of detail. You could have a look at our paper on the website of the Brookings Institution, and you can see that even in relatively severe versions of a cyber run, these banks have more than adequate liquidity. First, they have enough liquidity in almost any scenario just based on what they have on hand in terms of central bank deposits and immediately available treasuries and agency securities. Secondly, in the more extreme events in which even that is not enough, the Fed is surely going to put a lot of foam on the runway. The Fed is there as a lender of last resort. You couldn't imagine a scenario that's more appropriate for a lender of last resort to provide liquidity to these banks. Why? Because, well, first, they're not insolvent, which is one of the key criteria. And secondly, if the Fed were not to supply liquidity, it could become an issue of survivability of one of these banks, and the Fed simply doesn't want to do that. The final reason the Fed would step in is that the Fed wants these banks to continue to provide lots of liquidity to their customers. So I'm not concerned, and my co-author Josh Younger and I are not concerned that the banks themselves would fail because of this kind of an event. If these depositors were to avoid the banking system, they might not be able to make their payments to others quickly enough to avoid a problem for the economy. If securities transactions slow down, if very large payroll runs are delayed, if payments for large shipments and merchandise are delayed, the U.S. economy is just going to slow down. The GDP growth number for that quarter could be significantly reduced just by banks slowing down, the customers of banks slowing down their payments. So what we really want to address is the ability of the system to continue to process payments quickly enough to keep the economy going at its normal speed, or close as possible to its normal speed. Now, with respect to how to address the problem, well, we talk about a number of mitigating approaches. One of these is certainly to do stress testing, to just run tabletop exercises and other tests of whether the banking system could continue to process payments and whether the customers of the banks would likely continue to use the banking system to make payments under these circumstances. And there's quite a lot of work that's being done on this right now, both in the US and internationally. Some of it is traditional kind of red team, blue team exercise where the players in a stress scenario are presented with a situation and then are asked live to make decisions while other players are making their decisions. And you could even imagine some actors pretending to be malicious actors attempting to bring down the payment system. A second approach to this problem is to set up an alternative method by which payments could be made if large wholesale depositors are afraid to use the banking system while the cyber event is in progress. And Josh and I focused quite a bit of our attention on this idea of an alternative backup approach to making payments. One technique that we developed for the purposes of this, which is quite speculative, is to have on standby an emergency payment node, which sounds magnificent, but really what it is, it's just another bank whose only purpose in life is to stand up when and if there's a cyber event and to make payments for large bank customers during the cyber event and then shut down again. So what's special about an EPN, which is formally just a bank, that distinguishes it from any other bank, is that it's not active except during a cyber event. So it's very unlikely to be corrupted by the cyber event itself, since it hasn't been handling any transactions. And it's been built special purpose to act as a very hardened protective shell for the banking system. The idea here is that if I'm a large depositor in one of the largest banks, I will already have set up an account at this emergency payment node that's dormant. All the legal and operational facilities are available, and then when the red flag goes up and the cyber event has been declared, someone in my bank hits a switch and automatically my payments are made through this emergency payment node rather than through my normal bank. So setting up an EPN so that it's always ready for a cyber event would be quite expensive. Just imagine all the legal costs, all the accounts have to be set up just as they would for a normal bank account. For large transactional deposits, that's quite expensive, a lot of lawyers. Then there's the software and hardware that's required. And you know, a problem is that you're paying this all the time, and hopefully the cyber event never happens, or if it happens, it's only very occasionally. So it's quite expensive in terms of a solution for this problem. It might be an expense that people are quite willing to bear, but it's not to be neglected. So an emergency payment node, or EPN, would rely on the existing Fedwire payment system to actually move money, which means that the Fedwire itself is mission critical. So this is not a way to avoid using Fedwire or ACH. This is a way to avoid using the banks as nodes. You continue to use the same links in the system. Otherwise, it would be extremely expensive. The idea of putting up a whole new method for messaging and sending money, which is only used occasionally, that would be dreadfully expensive. Circumstances. So if there were no emergency payment node, the money would probably get stored in money market funds and direct ownership of government securities. If there were an emergency payment node available, the money might get moved into that emergency payment node as needed to make payments. And of course, any surplus could be stored in money market funds. To the extent that banks were considered safe enough, wholesale depositors might continue to use the banks, but you wouldn't want to count on that in every circumstance. The money market funds themselves already have accounts at the largest banks, and in fact, they do effectively provide a backup source of deposit function for large wholesale depositors. And that would be the first safe haven. If you were trying to avoid the banking system as a large wholesale depositor, you would move your money into a government money market fund. The problem is that they can't process transactions fast enough to keep the economy spinning along at its normal speed. So what you'd really like is that the money market funds and other large wholesale depositors have this backup node where they can process payments. And so you don't rely on money market funds alone to keep the system going. Yeah, one alternative which might seem radical is the idea of, rather than setting up a new bank, to simply give these very large wholesale depositors, say 100 of them, accounts directly in the Fed. And then the Fed effectively becomes the emergency payment node. This is obviously a more elegant solution, but it would depart from the norms at the Fed of giving accounts to non-banks. And while it's been raised in conversations I've had, it would really be up to the Fed as to whether they would be willing to do this. If they were, then it would significantly reduce the cost of running this system, because you wouldn't have to set up an emergency payment node. Neither of these approaches will get rid of the concern that Fedwire itself could suffer from a cyber event. From my understanding, Fedwire is extremely resilient, and it's also the case that trying to avoid the use of Fedwire would be dramatically more expensive than the two approaches that I just mentioned. So this is as far as Josh and I got in our analysis of reasonable approaches. Here's how I look at it. This EPN is at least as good as any other bank. It's a bank in itself, and it's designed, purpose-built to handle cyber events. So it's likely to be a much stronger node from the viewpoint of cyber resiliency than any of the existing banks. The downside, of course, is that you're putting all your eggs in one basket. And so a malicious actor might decide to work twice as hard in order to bring down the emergency payment node at the same time that it brings down some other banks. You can't rule out all possible attacks. You can only do what's reasonable in light of the most likely forms of attack. Okay, so I wouldn't worry about the emergency payment node being a permanent or indefinite player in the financial system, because by design it only is stood up in the event of a cyber attack, and then it is immediately turned off as soon as the cyber attack is over. And in the meantime, you could use either operational or regulatory methods to prevent it from becoming such an attractive safe haven that it essentially absorbed all of the safe assets in the financial system. It's supposed to be built only for making transactions, not for storing funds like a safe haven would be. So while the emergency payment node would have its account most likely at the New York Fed, since that's where most of the largest wholesale transactions are made, the key to its usefulness is that it has access to the entire Fedwire system, so that a customer with an account at the Boston Fed could continue to process payments if it had an account at the emergency payment node as well, simply by accessing it through the Fedwire system. Okay, so the way that the global payment system is set up is essentially it's a system of non-overlapping currency by currency payment systems. So that if you are an industrial client of JP Morgan in US dollars and you want to send euros to a customer in Frankfurt, then you'll have JP Morgan take the dollars out of your US dollar account, send the dollars to, let's say, Deutsche Bank's dollar account, and then have Deutsche Bank send euros through the euro payment system to the ultimate customer in Europe. There's essentially no overlap between these payment systems, operationally speaking. So in designing methods for mitigating the kind of risk that we're discussing, which is a risk to a payment system, you pretty much have to do it for each payment system independently of the others. SWIFT is not a payment system, it's merely a message system. So you couldn't use SWIFT as a kind of global backup payment system. It merely sends messages regarding what payments are supposed to be made in each local currency's payment system. Okay, yet another approach to mitigating this problem is to have an independent payment system, unreliant on the banks. For example, a stablecoin, which is a form of cryptocurrency that's tokenized and could be used as a payment medium outside of the banking system. My concern with that runs into a number of different factors. First, it's very difficult to have a stablecoin-based payment system that's secure from the viewpoint of money laundering and other illegal uses. Secondly, it could interfere, at least in smaller countries, probably not in the US, with monetary policy. Because when the Fed raises its interest rates, you really want those rates to be reflected in interest rates on all forms of money in the economy and not merely on bank deposits and fiat currency-based funds. Thirdly, you wouldn't really want a stablecoin to be a safe haven from the banking system to the extent that a massive flight from the banking system into stablecoins could destabilize both the banks and the ability to make payments through the macroeconomy. So for all these reasons, I think an alternative digital currency that's not based on the backbone of the banking system is probably not a good idea. So with respect to communication with the Fed, what it views as important, I know from conversations that the Fed is very focused on cyber risk in general. They have lots of public documents and speeches by leaders in the Fed about what the Fed is doing in this area.